Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. Today, we have the first of two discussions looking at the importance of the U.S. Supreme Court, the American system of justice, and the rule of law in this year's presidential election cycle. A week from today, Thursday, a week from today, we will be talking to Sarah Isgur and David French. They are the co-hosts of the podcast Advisory Opinions, which is produced by the Dispatch. But today we're going to be talking with the new president of the American Constitution Society, Russ Feingold. Obviously, the name Feingold is very familiar to all of us here in Wisconsin. Senator Feingold served the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. Senate from 1993 to 2011. After his years of public service, he wrote a book about the post-9/11 era. He was a special envoy to the Great Lakes region in Africa, and he has been teaching at a number of different law schools: Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and yes, Marquette University Law School. And so we welcome him back to Marquette. Senator, I hope you've been doing well.
I'm doing great. I'm over here in Wisconsin in Middleton, and I have such warm feelings about Marquette Law School. I can honestly tell you that my year there teaching was one of my favorite jobs I ever had. I needed a job after the 2010 election, and thanks to the dean and you guys, you welcomed me, and it's an excellent place. And I have lasting friendships that continue from Marquette Law School, and pleased to be reconnecting with you.
We are delighted to have you with us today, Senator. I wanted to begin by talking about this new role for you, a role that you took on this year as president of the American Constitution Society. Tell us a little bit about how that happened, and then we'll spend a little bit of time learning more about what ACS does and is doing.
Well, you know, I was actually teaching at Harvard Law School, a visiting professor, and I was walking in the rain, and I have this tendency to pick up my phone and check my messages all the time. And there was you know, too much, my wife says. Yeah. But there was this voicemail saying, hey, you know, we're a headhunter firm and we're looking for a CEO of an organization. And, you know, I thought, okay, the last time that happened, somebody tried to get me to go on the board and invest in a vaping company. So, you know, you'd think a former U.S. senator would get all kinds of offers. Not really. And so I called up. Turns out it was to be the CEO or the president of the American Constitution Society. And I've had good encounters with the ACS at places like Marquette and all the law schools I've taught at. American Constitution Society was founded 20 years ago in response, frankly, to the success of the Federalist Society, which has been around for 40 years and has really promoted conservative legal views and, frankly, the development of people to become very conservative judges. And they've basically taken over the courts, including the Supreme Court. So progressives like me and others are attracted to the idea of a progressive legal network. It's the largest progressive legal network in the country by far. We have chapters in over 200 law schools. There are 50 lawyer chapters, including one in Milwaukee and Madison, that are excellent. And, you know, what we try to do is combine the academic skills of our members from the law schools with the student chapters and their networks with activists on issues that we care about. So it is a progressive, legally oriented organization. And we are particularly focused right now on at least two things. One is the institutional racism in this country that's been so highlighted in recent months. And secondly, we are preparing with a grassroots list of people to recommend to be federal judges in case there is a change of administration. So those are two of the things that are big projects of ACS at this time.
Well, we'll talk about both of those in the minutes ahead. Do you feel like your organization is an effective counterweight to the Federalist Society at this point in time?
I don't think it always has been, because it doesn't have the resources and the billionaire supporters that the other organization does. It also doesn't have such a narrow focus on certain issues. Progressives and liberals tend to disagree more. So it's like, you know, like your whole family together at Thanksgiving kind of thing. But I think that's changing. And, you know, I've really tried to make sure this organization will be higher profile and make sure people can say, look, where is the progressive response to what's happened? And I think we are very aggressively and appropriately raising the profile of the organization. And, you know, one of the ironies, Mike, is somehow this COVID thing has greatly enhanced our connectivity. It used to be that the various chapters would do their own programming, and they would hope they could get some big speaker like Sally Yates, the one that was at the Justice Department.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she could only go to so many places. So now what they do is they have a Zoom conference call, and you can have lots of different chapters at the same time. And then they're sort of connecting with each other and talking to them about projects they have on, protecting the vote, for example. So I do think that in the last few months, it's self-serving for me to say this, I do think that we have significantly raised our profile. And, I was prominently featured on a number of television shows last week about the Supreme Court nomination. So we want people to know we're here and we're ready for the fight. And we expect to be very active in the coming years.
Let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court nomination. We have heard just in the last couple of days that Senate Majority Leader McConnell wants to have a vote on the nomination as soon as Monday. What's your response to how this nomination process has worked?
Well, it's hard for me to find the words. The word outrageous, disgusting. This is totally wrong. What they did here to first cynically deny Barack Obama his right to fill the seat that came open early in 2016, basically stealing a Supreme Court seat from the duly elected president of the United States. And then now to jam through this nomination, even before Justice Ginsburg was buried, to have the commitments and the votes all lined up, even before senators knew who was going to be. They were saying, oh yeah, I'll vote for whoever comes through. I mean, this is an abdication, a complete abdication of the constitutional responsibility of the Senate to advise and consent. To be honest with you, I understand that Trump would try to nominate somebody. That's sort of normal. But for the Senate to just say, oh yeah, we're going to jam this through no matter what. I mean, I've raised the question, what happens if somebody, God forbid, dies on December 20th? Are they going to do another one in 2 weeks too? What's the limit? And there's never been a Supreme Court justice confirmed. Lindsey Graham admitted this after July 24th in an election like this. So this is an abuse of our Constitution. It's abuse of the process. And really, as far as I'm concerned, Mike, I hate to say it, and I can't believe I am saying it, they're delegitimizing the United States Supreme Court. They are making it look like a kangaroo court in the eyes of the American people because of this process.
Those are strong words. No, they are strong words. You have said, and I've seen other interviews where you say you believe that the right has stolen the U.S. Supreme Court. Those are strong words, Senator.
Well, to me, stealing is when you take something that's not yours. And that Supreme Court seat should not have been Donald Trump's. The Merrick Garland one, it should have been Barack Obama's. That's stealing. And this one is potentially stealing because it depends on whether there would be another president. And if there is another president as of January 20th, I think the only appropriate thing under the normal norms and understandings of the Constitution would be that the person who's sworn in on January 20th would be the person that would make that nomination. So to me, they've stolen 2 out of 9 seats. And I don't see any other way to describe it. Mike, I don't come at this as sort of a guy that's always been flailing around in this. I served on the Judiciary Committee for 16 years. I participated in 4 of these. I voted for 2 others. I participated in the whole process for 4 Supreme Court nominees, 2 by President Bush, 2 by President Obama. I voted for Chief Justice Roberts. I wasn't playing a partisan game. I got a lot of heat from progressives saying, what are you doing voting for that guy? He's going to do this. He's going to do that. I played it straight. And that's because they followed the process. We all got a call, who do you think we should nominate? Each of us got a chance to carefully spend some time preparing. We got an hour to talk to each of the nominees, all 4 of them privately. We got to question them, not on a rushed basis, but after we'd had a chance to do some research on the people. And, you get calls from around the country from people. It happens that Roberts and I were in the same law school class at Harvard, but it was such a huge class, I never even met the guy. But people called me that knew me and said, liberals called me and said, he's conservative, but he's, fair-minded or whatever it was. This is the way the process should work. If you're going to really have advise and consent, that's not what this is.
So your concern, Senator, is that the process is so compressed and, in your opinion, so rushed that it doesn't do what Supreme Court nominations historically have done. It's that concern, and not so much you're not unhappy because of the fact that Merrick Garland did not move forward. Does that play any role in how you feel about this? That you feel like they're just setting the rules differently this time around?
Right. It's not about Merrick Garland or Amy Coney Barrett. They're both enormously talented. Frankly, so was Gorsuch, who was appointed to take these people are people that who knows, I may have voted for them with the proper process if I was in the Senate. That's not the question. The question is whether the process works. And, the problem, Mike, is they're setting off in a situation where progressives and Democrats and others may have no choice but to consider changing the basic nature of judicial tenure or the number of members on the Supreme Court. Our organization is not allowed to and does not endorse particular proposals. But when you have been stolen from, and I will maintain that view, there needs to be compensation. There needs to be reparations. Something has to be done to undo this, or the United States Supreme Court is going to be in a free fall in terms of its credibility. A lot of people, one of the great things about, having taught at Marquette and the other law schools, I've had a chance to really delve more deeply into legal history than I had in the past, or for many years. People don't realize is it was not automatic. The founders did not necessarily think that the Supreme Court should have the power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. That came in Marbury versus Madison, when Chief Justice Marshall, years later, said, actually, we here are expounding the Constitution, and we can declare laws unconstitutional. And that became, over time, understood. But it was based on the idea that the court was an independent, legitimate organization that was filled by people who went through a certain process. That very assumption is being questioned. And what that means is, if this isn't fixed, what the Supreme Court does may not be taken as seriously as it should be. And in fact, if they start knocking down all kinds of things like the Affordable Care Act and other things, what they're essentially doing is replacing themselves for the duly elected people, representatives of the people of our country. And so there's a lot at stake here.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of that. Are you worried, in fact, that at least portions of the Affordable Care Act are now or will soon be very vulnerable, that even a contested election might be in the hands of the Supreme Court? Are you worried about those kinds of real world things at this moment in time?
Yeah, I've learned not to discount my worries. I'm an optimist by nature, and my wife started saying early on in the Trump years, this could happen, that could happen. And, she's right. There's no limit, apparently. Thanks to people like Chief Justice Roberts in a number of cases, the more extreme things were not done. But this could change that. And there is a risk that the Affordable Care Act could be struck down on, I think, bogus grounds. There is a risk that Roe v. Wade would be overturned, or the right to choose would be gutted. There is a risk that there will be further damage done to the right to vote. The ability of people to collectively organize through labor unions may be greatly harmed by Supreme Court decision. These aren't idle worries. These are agenda items that we've seen from the Koch brothers and from ALEC and others. These are things they've wanted to do forever. And frankly, they may have the chance to do it now if the court goes in this direction and if nothing is done in response to it. So there's an enormous amount at stake.
So I want to go back to something you just said, and this notion of reparations because of what has happened in the court. And I know that you also indicated that your organization doesn't weigh in on these policy initiatives, but the two that are being talked about, and frankly, we polled on them in the latest national poll of Supreme Court attitudes that Marquette University Law School did. So there is support for making sure that Supreme Court appointments are not lifetime appointments, that there were essentially term limits. There's a little less support for the idea of expanding the court, packing, as some people call it. What I hear you saying is that those items should at least be on the table for further discussion, correct?
Absolutely. And, this is what sort of we've been forced to. I like to tell the story that when I was lucky enough in 2011 to be honored at the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, went out there for a nice weekend and I got a tour of the grounds. And they were telling me this happened here and this happened there, and Roosevelt did this here, and Eleanor Roosevelt did this here. And then I said, well, I asked a question about the court packing plan. And my tour guide said to me, Senator, here we refer to that as the court reform plan. So in those days, I considered anything like this that you just described to be outrageous. I thought, well, why would you do that? You're going to hurt the integrity of the Supreme Court. Well, a lot of us have had to re-examine that because we see the integrity of the Supreme Court being undercut right now. Now, in terms of those alternatives, there's probably more support for term limits because it seems sort of logical to people. Having people serve on there who come on 35 and to be there when they're 100. I don't think the founders really intended that. And then we had this awful spectacle of, Justice Ginsburg being really ill and just hanging on. It was almost like a death watch kind of thing that I think was craven and is not a good thing for our system. The problem, of course, with that alternative, unlike the other one, is it requires a constitutional amendment in order to do what a number of, actually the Federalist Society people were the first ones to propose like an 18-year term limit. And now there are very prominent law professors who want something like that. The other alternative, expanding or decreasing the number of justices, does not require a constitutional amendment. It's just legislation. It's been done before. People have learned through this process, the Supreme Court has not always been 9. It's been 7 at different times, and it can change. It's been that way for a long time. But all it would take would be 2 houses voting for it and the president signing it. And so that's probably easier to do, without a doubt. And it would provide immediate relief because those same bodies would be able to fill those judicial seats right away. And so then people say, well, what happens when it shifts back again? Well, that's the problem, to be honest. This could be an eternal back and forth. So what I've tried to say is there a way we could start having a conversation about some kind of a compromise where reparations, I like to call it, a recompense would be made for what I call the theft of these 2 Senate seats, but it wouldn't have to be a permanent kind of thing. In other words, a compromise. So those are the kinds of conversations I think we should have, not only within the progressive legal community, but nationally, and engage the American people, because I think most people see that there's something wrong with the way the Supreme Court is functioning and where the nomination process works. It isn't very attractive.
So do you fear that if you looked at some of these items that we've just been discussing, whether it's expansion of the court or term limits, does that contribute to your larger concern that people see this as Democrats responding politically to what has occurred? And this takes us down a road where the court does begin to be perceived as more and more political, that it's a political entity rather than a legal body. Do you have that concern that we're starting down this path? Maybe you think we're already down that path.
Started a long time ago. That's the problem. Like I said, when I was in the Senate, voted for a Republican nominee, voted against one. It didn't seem particularly political. I didn't have any question in my mind that George Bush got to fill those seats. That's changed. You have people like even my dear friend, late friend, John McCain, said in 2016 that if Hillary Clinton got elected, they wouldn't fill any Supreme Court seats for 4 years. Well, that was just wrong. We know that's wrong. And so what has happened now is that this has been weaponized by the right and turned into a biased Supreme Court, in my view. And so, yes, it could get worse if Democrats do it in a reckless way. On the other hand, you'd have to be an absolute fool to let one side do whatever they want and you don't ever respond. You just take it. I learned that on the playground. That doesn't work very well. So that's why I'm trying to raise a conversation about, is there a middle ground here? Is there a way to address our very strong feelings that something horribly wrong has happened without going whole hog, without being overly aggressive. And you know me from my work on these things and in the Senate, being a strong bipartisan senator when I was there, I would hope that would be the outcome and that both sides would pull back from the brink and we could get back to some of the traditions of let's have enough time for nominees. Let's not have nominees for the Supreme Court jammed through at the end of an administration and, get back to some kind of norms and rules.
Senator, you've obviously spent a lot of years in public service and elective office, and I want to have you address the importance of the Supreme Court in, for example, this election cycle. I think there's been this school of thought that Supreme Court appointments, the Supreme Court is more important to conservatives than it has been to progressives historically. I'm wondering if you think that's true and if you think that's changed.
It is true, and it's to the embarrassment of progressives that, of all people, progressives should have figured out a long time ago that it was a progressive court, the Warren Court, that brought us some of the greatest legal achievements in the history of this country, particularly Brown versus Board of Education, but also all the criminal defense issues, the challenging of the death penalty, and affirmative action. I mean, the court was crucial. And so somehow I think liberals and progressives got the idea that the court would always be fine and would always be there as a backstop to protect people's rights. But the right was smart about this. They figured out they could organize in a certain way through the Federalist Society and others and train people who would be very hard right and unlike the justices that, at least when I was growing up, we watched. The thing I loved about the Supreme Court, and I grew to love as a young man, even a high school kid, was you didn't know just because somebody was appointed by a Democrat or Republican what they were going to do. And that's not because they were irrational or crazy. It's because they didn't think their job was to follow a party line. That was the key to the credibility of the United States Supreme Court. I mean, you look at even under people appointed by Republicans. It was a Republican justice who wrote the majority opinion in Roe v. Wade. And so what has happened is this has become horribly politicized, and yet it's taken an awful long time for progressives to understand that just letting the right run the table on the Supreme Court and courts, to understand that that's just devastating. And, McCain and I fought our heads off and succeeded in passing the McCain-Feingold bill, and it was upheld just 5-4 by Justice O'Connor. But a few years later, even though this was the will of the people of this country, even George Bush signed the legislation. The court figured out another way to undercut they didn't overturn McCain-Feingold, but they overturned a law from 1907, the Tillman Act, that prevented corporations from giving to campaigns. And so you see there that even when you spend years and years passing legislation, if the court is all tilted in one direction because we've been asleep at the switch, we're not going to be able to get legislation approved that is crucial and wanted by the American people. Of course, healthcare is a tremendous example of that.
We spend a lot of time talking about the Supreme Court, and rightly so, but the other phenomenon that has occurred over the last nearly 4 years is that you've had more than 200 federal judges appointed and confirmed. You made the interesting comment at the beginning of this conversation that what you want to do and you want your organization to do is start identifying potential judges who would perhaps have a different way of looking at the law than the most recent crop that has been nominated and confirmed. Where are you in that process? What exactly are you doing on that front?
This is our biggest focus right now, and your numbers are correct because there was a horrible blocking of the opportunities for President Obama to fill a lot of those seats. By the time Trump came in, he had tons of vacancies, and they were very aggressive in filling them. And frankly, they filled them in a way that was overwhelmingly not diverse, overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly younger justices, some of whom weren't even rated as qualified by the American Bar Association. What's our goal? Our goal is not to appoint ideologues. Our goal is to appoint people who will be good judges. In other words, people who will be independent, people who will look at each case on its own merits. But it should also reflect the diversity and the reality of America today. So because we have this national network that I described at the beginning, Our 40 lawyer chapters have created, 50 lawyer chapters have created 40 working groups. Sometimes it's combined, like in California. And they are submitting to us names of people that they, in their community, working with the NAACP, working with Latinx groups, working with LGBTQ groups, working with groups that include public defenders, not just corporate lawyers and others. They are sending us names that we can submit either to a potential presidential transition or a new White House, or to senators who, of course, have the role in the Senate. And frankly, again, the asleep at the switch idea, under Clinton and especially under Obama, this didn't happen very fast. It wasn't given much priority. And this is what you were right about. The priority that's assigned to it is different in conservatives and progressives. We are turning that around. We are getting these names within the law, ready, vetted, and ready to go. Now, you have to wait for a vacancy, of course. But, there are many judges who are on senior status or who may want to retire, and they may be waiting for a change in administration. So we're going to be the organization in this country that is providing a truly national list. It's not going to be some DC or New York based list. It's going to be based on the actual communities, from San Diego to Indianapolis to Miami to Madison, Wisconsin, that are ready to go. And we believe that a great generation of judges may come from this if the election goes a certain way. Obviously, not if the election goes another way.
If there is a President Biden, are you looking to be able to talk with him directly about sort of the work that you're doing or the ideas you have about potential nominees? How would that work exactly?
Well, that'd be great. I wouldn't hold my breath that would happen, but certainly we would talk to whoever we could as appropriate. Now, ACS, once somebody's nominated, we don't advocate for them. Once that has actually occurred, other groups who have different types of organizations would do that. But we are able to participate in the process of sort of recommending people. But yes, I've already talked to some members of the Senate about things like in our circuit here, Seventh Circuit. There are no African-American judges on the Seventh Circuit right now, if you can believe that. I mean, Milwaukee, Chicago, Kenosha, Racine, Gary, Indianapolis. How is that? And so we're going to be sending the message. There needs to be more diversity in the federal courts. People who come into court have to be able to see people that look or seem like them sometimes. And so this is part of our focus. It's not just getting good people, which we want, not just people that, reflect, basically what we're saying to these working groups is, get us a list of people that your lawyers would like to practice law in front of, because that's very important to judges, but also the lack of diversity in the federal courts needs to be addressed. And our organization has been pointing out this gap for years, and it's time to address it.
I want to talk about the racial justice issue in just a moment, but I did want to ask you a question about the relationship that you see between the president and the attorney general, Bill Barr. I think there was this thinking that when Bill Barr was named to that post, that he would bring perhaps a more traditional way of operation to the White House, to that office. But there are now a lot of people who don't see it that way. How do you see it? And how would you describe how Bill Barr has handled the job as the nation's attorney general?
Well, Mike, you might have used up all my superlatives on the question about the Supreme Court. Let me call this one terrible. And I'm shocked. And it's because of what you said. This guy was the attorney general under Bush the first, and everybody thought, oh, good, he's appointing somebody who seemed to be like a professional attorney general. And I thought, oh, finally, Trump's doing something that's a little more careful. I don't know what happened, but this man somehow believes that he is the attorney general for Donald Trump. But he's the attorney general of the United States. And he's broken all the China. He's broken all the rules about not trying to interfere in sentencing, about the independence of U.S. attorneys and having them removed for political reasons. That, as far as I'm concerned, he did a hatchet job on the Mueller report. He has gutted, essentially, again, just like the Senate, the mores and traditions of the Justice Department, which is such a bulwark of our legal system. And, there's a historical analogy here too from a Republican president, where after Watergate, Gerald Ford, of course, was president. And he knew that the Justice Department had been greatly damaged by John Mitchell, as part of the Watergate conspiracy. And he appointed Edward Levy. Edward Levy was the president of the University of Chicago, conservative. I mean, the guy, Republican, and he supported Robert Bork for Supreme Court. But Levy came in and said, my job is to restore the credibility of the Justice Department. That's what a new president has to do. He has to appoint somebody who's going to say, I don't care if Democrats want this or Republicans need to do this. He needs to reestablish the independence of the Justice Department, because Bill Barr has basically destroyed it in a way that I frankly couldn't believe he would do.
What is your reaction when you hear the president in the final days of the campaign calling on Attorney General Barr to file criminal charges against the Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden, almost demanding that he file charges against him? What does that sound like to you?
It's entirely inappropriate. It's a president of the United States who thinks the presidency is his own personal toy, and that he's not part of a hundreds of years of tradition and rules. And so he figures, oh, the Attorney General works for me. He'll do whatever, he has to do whatever I say. And I can't believe I even have to say this to Marquette Law School, because everybody there knows darn well it's wrong. But this is what our current president is willing to do. I think Barr actually may have had it already. He probably figures that maybe he shouldn't respond to this. But yeah, the president has no filter when it comes to these things, and he's asking for things that any other president, I think, would have been embarrassed to say.
Take a few moments to describe for us what your organization and what you're doing on the issue of racial justice, something you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. What specifically is the work that you're doing?
The organization has long been very focused on the obvious institutional racism in the country, and has done programming on it for many years. But I'd be lying if I didn't tell you that we were galvanized by the George Floyd incident and Breonna Taylor and others. It happened that our national convention, which we had to do virtually, was just after that. And so we turned over our very substantial national convention to a special focus on racial injustice. Now, a lot of the programming, Mike, a lot of the programs we were doing with scholars and activists and the work that people were doing in the communities, of course, focused on policing and things like whether or not qualified immunity should be a defense for policemen. But what I realized is this isn't just about policing. Institutional racism is a problem in many contexts in our country. Frankly, I was appalled when Judge Barrett couldn't say clearly that institutional racism is a systemic problem throughout our system. She was very cautious about it. But the good news is that because the reaction to this has been so powerful, people are now looking at all institutions as all having potentially this characteristic. So it has to do with incarceration. It has to do with access to healthcare. It has to do with the work environment. Look who has to go to work. You and I, we can be in a pretty safe environment, but those that have to get up every morning and travel in public transportation and work, disproportionately people of color. Same thing goes with the death penalty, which has been racially biased forever. We've taken the lead in challenging Bill Barr's resumption of the federal death penalty. A moratorium on the federal death penalty was put in place under George Bush. There hadn't been one for 17 years in execution, and they have rushed to execute 5 people. They're about to execute the first woman who's been executed for 50 years. And the point we're trying to make is this isn't just about the death penalty. If you look at the statistics on the death penalty, both federally and nationally, it is overwhelmingly racially biased. So what we want to do is pull these strands together and say, this is the time when all institutions have to take head on, from the point of view of the law and legal principles, the discrimination and bias that exists. And we hope to raise that conversation regularly in the coming years.
Does this moment seem different to you? Do you feel that there is an opportunity for real change here? Or do you feel like this is something that will, as it has so many times in the past, just sort of begin to die down and we will just go on with the way things have been? Do you feel there will be real change anytime in the near future?
I think there will be, and this is where I tend to be an optimist, Mike. You're right. Course of my life, I saw Martin Luther King speak in person at Soldier Field when I was 15 years old. I thought this was all going to be done by the time I was 67 years old. So it's sickening to realize that it's happening, still happening, and maybe worse. But I think the younger generations, the ones that are in law school now and others, high school, I think they realize this has to change fundamentally. It's sort of like what's happened with LGBTQ issues, where, in our time, this was very much up in the air. But there's a much broader acceptance now of the change in that area that I think will stay. So this is harder because it's so ingrained in the American history. But I do think that it will be harder for those who try to resist change in this area to keep this under the rug. We'll see, but I'm hoping, and I think it'll be driven by the younger generations that are coming up who are going to say, we don't want to live in a divided racist society anymore.
We are nearing Election Day, and I wanted to get a couple of final thoughts on that from you. Do you think we're going to have an uneventful election, or do you think this will end up being the subject of litigation? What do you look for, in the days leading up to the election and in the days immediately following it?
I'm very concerned, as many, many Americans are, that this thing won't just end in an appropriate way, even if one person wins clearly. And that's because obviously there are certain attitudes and a willingness to use misinformation and phony claims to pretend that somehow the election did not have a legitimate outcome. It reminds me, Mike, you mentioned that I worked in Africa. In a lot of countries around the world for years, they struggled to create their democracy. And of course, no matter whether there was an election, whether it was true or not, the guys that lost always said, well, it was rigged. Well, sometimes it was rigged. A lot of times it was rigged. Sometimes it wasn't, but it was a standard move. We have a president right now who's already told us that he's going to say the same thing. He's going to say it was rigged. And, he's got a lot of people out there that believe in him that may believe that. And if that happens, and if he's willing to challenge it and go to the courts, we may have weeks of activity, months of litigation. And, then we're going to see how the Supreme Court behaves on this thing. The Supreme Court did not cover itself in glory in Bush v. Gore. Many of us resent the fact that was a partisan decision. I'm not saying for sure it was the wrong decision, but it was definitely partisan, 5-4. And this may be nothing compared to what could happen here if somehow the Supreme Court says, actually, this was a flawed election. Nothing would be more dangerous for the stability of the United States of America than that. So I am concerned, very concerned. And people are preparing for every scenario. There's the scenario where this thing gets kicked into the House of Representatives. If there's states that are really close and they can't resolve who won the state, then it goes to the House. And in the House, every state gets only one vote. So that's to the advantage of conservatives. It's possible that there would be an overwhelming victory for Biden, but if you went with that kind of an approach and they were willing to just vote for whoever they wanted as opposed to who their state was for in the election, we could have another constitutional crisis. I think people will stand back from the abyss here. I think people will realize that we're going to have complete chaos in this country if it comes to that. So I'll end on an optimistic note. I think in the end, it will be resolved by January 20th, but it might take close to that long.
And how would you describe the state of our democracy right now?
Almost critically ill, seriously ill. And if we don't work very aggressively to repair it, in the near future, it will become critically ill.
Senator Russ Feingold is the newish, I don't want to say the new, but the newish president of the American Constitution Society, the progressive legal organization. Again, we wanted to mention that we will be back a week from today with a different perspective on some of these same issues. But Senator, it's good to see you again. Thanks very much for taking time with us. We really appreciate it.
Say hi to the dean and all my friends at the law school.
Okay, I will do that. And we want to thank everybody who watched today. Good to see you again, and we'll see you next time on The Issues.